What's up, everybody? Day 5 in the hospital. Been a blessing. I needed it. Haven't done anything for 5 days. Feeling better. Broke the femur in my hip.
Hall of Famer Mark Coleman lost all his wealth due to expensive medical bills and was forced to create a GoFundMe to pay for treatment. Mike Perry left a fight with $6 and was behind on his taxes. Hall of Famer Penn now begs for help online, believing imposters replaced his family. These shocking falls from grace are just 3 of 10 devastating stories in this video. Mike Perry. Mike Perry burst onto the UFC scene as one of the most entertaining and controversial figures in the welterweight division, a raw-knuckled brawler with devastating power and absolutely zero filter when it came to speaking his mind. His aggressive fighting style and explosive knockouts earned him a devoted following, and his social media presence attracted hundreds of thousands of followers who couldn't look away from his unpredictable antics, both inside and outside the cage. With over 400,000 followers across various platforms, Perry seemed to have built a brand that would translate into financial success and long-term security, but the reality behind the Instagram posts and the highlight reel knockouts told a drastically different story. In 2019, Perry revealed the shocking truth about his earnings, pulling back the curtain on what professional fighters actually take home after all the deductions, fees, and expenses are accounted for. For a fight that earned him $58,000 in disclosed pay, a figure that might sound impressive to the average person, Perry ended up with a mere $6 in his pocket after everything was said and done. Let that sink in for a moment. $6, not $6,000, not $600, $6 actual dollars. The breakdown of his earnings painted a disturbing picture of the economics of professional fighting at the highest level. First came the taxes, including $17,000 that went to Uruguay, where apparently some portion of his income was subject to taxation. Perry's financial struggles were compounded by a series of legal troubles and personal controversies that damaged his earning potential and marketability. Domestic violence allegations, DUI arrests, and incidents involving racial slurs created a toxic cloud around his public image, causing sponsors to distance themselves and limiting his opportunities for supplemental income outside the cage. In a desperate attempt to generate additional income, Perry resorted to auctioning off spots in his corner during fights, literally selling the opportunity for fans to be part of his team on fight night. Eventually recognizing that the UFC model wasn't working for him financially, Perry made the transition to Bare Knuckle Fighting Championship, or BKFC, where he found better compensation and a more suitable platform for his fighting style. While Perry at least managed to eventually find a more lucrative fighting opportunity and rebuild some financial stability, our next fighter's legal troubles and violent behavior would ensure that his earning days were permanently over. Melvin Guillard. Melvin Guillard was poetry in motion when he was on his game, an explosive lightweight striker whose knockout power and athletic prowess earned him numerous performance bonuses and the admiration of fight fans worldwide. His dynamic style and willingness to engage in thrilling exchanges made him a perennial fan favorite, the kind of fighter who could electrify an arena with a single perfectly timed punch or knee. But behind the highlight reel knockouts and performance bonuses lurked a pattern of destructive behavior and poor decision-making that would ultimately derail his career and drain his finances entirely. Guillard's post-UFC life became a nightmare of domestic violence arrests, including a particularly serious incident in 2018 where he was arrested for assault, charges that would follow him and damage his reputation for years to come. Substance abuse issues further complicated Guillard's downward spiral, contributing to his erratic behavior and poor judgment. The combination of legal problems and substance issues created a toxic cycle that destroyed his marketability and led to his exit from the UFC, the premier organization in mixed martial arts. Without the platform and exposure of the UFC, Guillard found himself bouncing from one smaller promotion to another, taking fights wherever he could find them, often on short notice and for significantly less money than he'd earned during his UFC tenure. By 2024, Guillard's situation had deteriorated to the point where he was living essentially paycheck to paycheck, or more accurately, fight purse to fight purse. He took short notice fights simply to make rent, accepting bouts with minimal preparation time because he desperately needed the money to keep a roof over his head. This hand-to-mouth existence was a far cry from his days as a UFC contender, earning substantial bonuses for exciting performances, where Guillard squandered his earnings through arrests and addictions that kept him perpetually broke but still fighting. Our next fighter actually earned more than $3 million during his career before losing it all to an even more devastating combination of substance abuse and outright fraud. Diego Sanchez. Diego Sanchez is a name that resonates with longtime UFC fans as one of the promotion's original superstars, a warrior who came to prominence as the winner of The Ultimate Fighter Season 1 and went on to compete in some of the most memorable battles in UFC history. Over the course of his extensive career, Sanchez earned over $3 million in disclosed fight purses, participating in wars against legends like Penn and establishing himself as one of the toughest and most entertaining fighters to ever step into the octagon. But Diego Sanchez's journey from millionaire fighter to penniless has-been is a masterclass dangerous and how quickly substantial wealth can evaporate when you combine addiction, poor financial management, toxic relationships, and outright fraud. Following a devastating loss in 2009, Sanchez turned to drugs and alcohol as coping mechanisms for the psychological toll of his brutal fighting career. What began as recreational use to deal with the stress and pain of his profession spiraled into full-blown addictions that clouded his judgment and influenced every decision he made for years to come. Let's not forget about how he got arrested for firing a weapon in his car on the highway. The substances weren't the only thing bleeding Sanchez's finances dry. A contentious custody battle consumed both his emotional energy and his financial resources, with legal fees mounting as the proceedings dragged on. Child support obligations and the costs associated with family law matters created an ongoing drain on his bank account that never seemed to end. But perhaps the most devastating blow to Sanchez's fortune came from someone he thought he could trust. A supposed friend betrayed that trust spectacularly, scamming Sanchez through Ponzi schemes that promised high returns, but delivered nothing except empty bank accounts and broken trust. Unlike Sanchez, who found redemption through faith and eventually rebuilt his fortune, our next fighter, a UFC Hall of Famer and pioneer of the sport, would never fully recover from the combination of medical disasters and bad investments that left him relying on charity just to survive. Mark Coleman. Mark Coleman is a genuine legend in the history of mixed martial arts, a pioneer whose innovations fundamentally changed how the sport is fought. Known as the inventor of ground and pound, Coleman won early UFC tournaments and became the promotion's first heavyweight champion, establishing a wrestling-based style that would influence generations of fighters to come. But championships and Hall of Fame inductions don't pay medical bills or guarantee financial security in retirement, as Coleman would learn through brutal, painful experience. By the time the 2010s arrived, Coleman was facing a perfect storm of health crises and financial disasters that would reduce a UFC champion and Hall of Famer to near-death poverty. Hip surgery complications became infected, requiring additional procedures and extended treatment that came with astronomical costs. The healthcare system's inefficiencies and price gouging became painfully apparent in Coleman's case.
What's up, everybody? Day 5 in the hospital. Been a blessing. I needed it. Haven't done anything for 5 days. Feeling better. Broke the femur in my hip.
Medical bills featured absurdities like $24 charges for individual IV bags, the kind of predatory pricing that can quickly bankrupt even people with substantial savings. The problem was compounded by timing. Coleman's insurance had lapsed right around his 50th birthday, leaving him completely exposed to the full cost of his complicated medical treatment. Without insurance coverage, the bills mounted into figures that would have been impossible for him to pay, even if he'd managed his money perfectly throughout his career. Unfortunately, Coleman hadn't managed his money perfectly, or even particularly well. Bad investments had already wiped out much of his savings, leaving him vulnerable when the medical crisis hit. Like many fighters of his era, Coleman hadn't received the kind of financial education or professional advice that might have helped him build and protect wealth for the long term. Alcoholism added another layer of complications, both in terms of its impact on his health and its contribution to poor financial decision-making. The situation became so desperate that Coleman's friend, fellow fighter Wes Sims, felt compelled to intervene. Sims launched a GoFundMe campaign to help pay for Coleman's rehabilitation and ongoing medical care, essentially asking the MMA community to chip in to save one of the sport's founding fathers from destitution. While Coleman's ruin came primarily from medical bills and poor investments beyond his control, the next fighter on our list destroyed his own life and finances through a pattern of violent criminal behavior that would ultimately send him to prison and leave him completely penniless. Leben. Chris Leben became a household name in the MMA community through his appearance on The Ultimate Fighter, where his tough-as-nails fighting style and willingness to stand and trade punches made him an instant fan favorite. His career was defined by brutal, exciting brawls that left fans on the edge of their seats and opponents battered and bloodied. In 2015, Leben's already troubled personal life exploded into criminal behavior when he broke into his ex-wife's home carrying a loaded rifle, an incident that would lead to felony charges and prison time. The circumstances surrounding the break-in revealed a man struggling with addiction, paranoia, and an inability to process the end of his marriage in a healthy way. The legal consequences were severe and immediate. A judge set bail at $500,000, an amount that Leben couldn't possibly pay, effectively ensuring he would remain incarcerated while awaiting trial. The criminal case was just the beginning of Leben's legal and financial nightmare. Child support arrears piled up while he was unable to work, creating debts that would follow him long after his release from prison. His ex-wife filed lawsuits seeking damages, adding civil legal fees to the already crushing burden of criminal defense costs. Whatever savings Leben had accumulated during his fighting career evaporated, consumed by attorneys, bail bondsmen, court fees, and the various costs associated with incarceration and legal proceedings. But the legal troubles were symptoms of deeper problems rather than the root cause of Leben's ruin. Addictions to various substances had been draining his finances and clouding his judgment for years, contributing to the paranoid thinking that led to the rifle incident. After serving his sentence and being released from prison, Leben found himself starting over from absolute zero. Actually, from less than zero given his outstanding debts and obligations. Broke and unemployable in most conventional fields due to his felony conviction, Leben has scraped by coaching at MMA gyms for minimal pay, where Leben at least found some measure of recovery through sobriety and now earns a modest living coaching. Our next fighter's mental health deterioration and arrests have left him completely broke with no income sources and ongoing instability that makes any form of employment virtually impossible. Jason Mayhem Miller. Jason Mayhem Miller was one of the most charismatic and entertaining personalities in mixed martial arts history, a fighter whose skills in the cage were matched only by his ability to captivate audiences with his larger-than-life personality. His success in Strikeforce and his stint in the UFC showcased his well-rounded abilities, but it was his hosting duties on MTV's Bully Beatdown that truly demonstrated his star power and crossover appeal. Instead, Miller's post-UFC career became a downward spiral of arrests, mental health crises, and increasingly erratic behavior that destroyed his earning potential and burned every bridge he'd built in the entertainment industry. Between 2013 and 2021, Miller accumulated over a dozen arrests for charges ranging from domestic violence to vandalism and various other offenses that painted a picture of a man completely out of control. The incidents grew progressively more bizarre and concerning. One particularly memorable episode involved a church standoff where Miller's behavior was so erratic and threatening that it required police intervention to resolve. Each arrest brought new legal fees, and many resulted in jail time that prevented Miller from earning income. The more serious charges required extensive legal defense, draining whatever financial resources he had left. In 2021, Miller was arrested for felony domestic violence and held without bail. Fines and court-ordered rehabilitation programs added to the mounting costs. But perhaps most devastating was the impact on his career prospects. Fight promotions that might have been willing to overlook one or two incidents eventually decided Miller was too much of a liability to work with. By the mid-2010s, Miller had formally declared bankruptcy. While Miller's mental health issues led to bankruptcy and ongoing poverty, at least he remains a free man, unlike our next fighter, whose brutal criminal violence resulted in 29 felony convictions and a life sentence that guarantees he'll never earn another dollar as long as he lives. War Machine, Jonathan Koppenhover. Jonathan Koppenhover, who fought under the name War Machine, was a talented welterweight fighter whose skills inside the octagon were unfortunately matched by a volatility and propensity for violence outside of it. His UFC career showed promise, but it was his behavior away from competition that would define his legacy in the most horrific way imaginable. While many fighters on this list went broke through poor financial decisions, addiction, or bad luck, War Machine's financial destruction stems from crimes so heinous that they resulted in the effective end of his life as a free man. In 2014, War Machine committed one of the most brutal assaults in MMA history when he attacked his ex-girlfriend, adult film actress Christy Mack. The details of the attack are almost too disturbing to recount, but the results speak to its severity. Mack suffered 18 broken bones in her face, along with numerous other injuries that required extensive medical treatment and reconstruction. The legal consequences were swift and severe. War Machine was convicted on 29 separate felony counts related to the assault, including kidnapping, sexual assault, and battery charges that reflected the full scope of his crimes. In 2017, he was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole only after serving 36 years, effectively a life sentence for a man who was in his 30s at the time of conviction. He remains incarcerated today, serving his time in a Nevada prison. The financial implications of War Machine's crimes were total and immediate. All sponsorships evaporated the moment the details of the assault became public. Any income from fighting or related activities ceased entirely. Legal fees for his defense consumed whatever assets he had, though ultimately no amount of legal representation could overcome the overwhelming evidence against him. He was left bankrupt with literally no assets to his name. Everything he'd earned during his fighting career was gone. At least War Machine's destruction came from his own horrific choices, whereas our next fighter fell into poverty and homelessness through no real fault of her own, simply being a lower-tier UFC fighter who lost fights and was released without any support system to catch her fall. Maria Agapova. Maria Agapova's story is heartbreaking in a different way from many others on this list because her financial ruin came despite doing nothing particularly wrong herself. She simply got caught in the harsh economic realities facing lower-tier UFC fighters who don't achieve sustained success or become major stars. But the MMA gods are cruel and fickle, and Agapova's trajectory didn't continue upward as hoped. She finished her UFC run with a 2-4 record before being released by the promotion in 2024. 4 losses in 6 fights, even if some were competitive, were enough for the UFC to decide. they had better prospects to invest in. Her release came at a particularly vulnerable time, leaving her without the platform or steady income that UFC employment provides. The aftermath of her UFC release quickly spiraled into a nightmare. Agapova became homeless, unable to afford rent or even food, forced to seek shelter wherever she could find it. The woman who had been performing in front of thousands of fans just months or years earlier was now sleeping in shelters and struggling to get enough to eat. In viral social media posts during 2024, Agapova revealed that she had nearly been exploited into adult entertainment work by people who saw her desperation and tried to take advantage of it. She described foiling a plot to sell her into sex slavery, a horrifying situation that highlights just how vulnerable homeless fighters become. Community aid and donations provided some relief, allowing her to address her most immediate needs, but this assistance was sporadic and insufficient to truly stabilize her situation. By late 2024, Agapova was homeless again after a BKFC fight fell through, revealing that "I've been in poverty for years." By early 2025, Agapova has attempted to continue her combat sports career through boxing and bare-knuckle fighting championship opportunities, but these ventures haven't provided the steady income or financial security she desperately needs. While Agapova's homelessness stemmed from simply losing fights in the UFC, our next fighter's descent into even more complete destitution included not just homelessness, but also drug addiction escalating to harder substances, depression, and the ultimate degradation of resorting to prostitution just to survive. Duda Santana. Duda Santana's story is perhaps the most devastating on this entire list because it combines every possible element of tragedy: extreme poverty, homelessness, addiction, exploitation, family estrangement, and the complete absence of any support system that might have prevented her total ruin. Santana made her UFC debut in 2019 but lost the fight, a disappointing result that was compounded when she received a doping suspension and was subsequently released by the promotion in 2020. The doping violation, whether intentional or accidental, destroyed her reputation and made it nearly impossible to find fighting opportunities elsewhere. Then the pandemic hit, and what was already a dire situation became catastrophic. With no fights available anywhere due to COVID-19 shutdowns, Santana descended into homelessness. Living on the streets with no income and no prospects, she turned to drugs as an escape from the horror of her daily existence. In her own words, "You start with a joint and end up prostituting yourself," describing how what began as marijuana use escalated to harder substances, creating an addiction cycle that further complicated any attempts to get her life back on track. The depths of Santana's desperation are almost incomprehensible. She became estranged from her family, losing even that potential safety net and support system. In order to obtain food and shelter, Santana resorted to prostitution, trading sex for the basic necessities of survival, a level of exploitation and degradation that no former professional athlete should ever have to experience. In heartbreaking interviews, she revealed, "I prostitute myself for a cigarette," describing the absolute rock bottom of her situation. She relied on aid from churches and charity organizations to supplement what little she could scrape together through other means. Depression, already a factor in her struggles, deepened into something far more severe as her situation showed no signs of improving. She cycled through unstable partners who provided temporary shelter, but no real security or path forward, often adding their own dysfunction and problems to Santana's already overwhelming burden. But as devastating as Santana's complete destitution is, our #1 spot goes to a fighter whose fall is even more shocking, not because his poverty is worse, but because he was a 2-division UFC champion and Hall of Famer who earned millions, yet now finds himself broke, isolated, and suffering from severe mental illness that has him believing his own family members are imposters. BJ Penn. BJ Penn's fall from grace is the most shocking and heartbreaking story on this list because of who he was at his peak and how far he has fallen. Penn was a genuine pioneer of mixed martial arts, a 2-division champion who held titles in both the lightweight and welterweight divisions, an achievement that places him in extremely rare company in UFC history. He was inducted into the UFC Hall of Fame for his contributions to the sport, with victories over legends like Matt Hughes and Diego Sanchez, cementing his legacy as one of the greatest fighters of his generation. During his career, Penn earned millions of dollars through fight purses, sponsorships, and endorsements, enough money to live comfortably for the rest of his life if managed properly. But proper management was not in the cards for BJ Penn. Following his retirement from active competition, Penn's life began to unravel in ways that would have seemed impossible during his championship years. By mid-2025, Penn was experiencing severe mental health issues, including what appears to be Capgras syndrome, a rare psychological condition where sufferers believe their family members have been replaced by imposters. Imagine the horror of looking at your loved ones and genuinely believing they are strangers pretending to be your family. This delusion has had devastating effects on Penn's relationships and his ability to function in everyday life. The mental health crisis manifested in increasingly erratic public behavior. In what can only be described as a nightmare week, Penn was arrested 3 times in just 6 days on charges including disorderly conduct and making threats. The arrests included violations of a temporary restraining order, reflecting a man completely unable to cope with whatever internal demons he was fighting, acting out in ways that were harmful to himself and potentially dangerous to others. Each arrest brought new legal complications, more fees, and further damage to his already fragile mental state. In a desperate video posted in July 2025, Penn made a public plea to UFC President Dana White and various UFC sponsors, begging them for help and claiming that he was about to have everything stolen from him. Penn specifically mentioned his Hawaii home being at risk, claiming that identity theft and legal battles over family property dating back to 2008 were threatening to take away everything he had left. Whether these claims are accurate reflections of reality or products of his compromised mental state is unclear, but what is undeniable is that a UFC Hall of Famer felt desperate enough to make such a public plea. The video was gut-wrenching to watch for anyone who remembered Penn in his prime. MMA fans and media outlets called it one of the saddest stories in MMA, a phrase that captures the tragedy of watching a once great champion reduced to begging for help on social media. Reports indicate Penn is now in a state of destitution with no savings left, his fortune consumed by a toxic combination of bad decisions and legal fees over the years. What makes Penn's situation particularly tragic is his isolation. He is currently inactive and isolated, cut off from the support systems and relationships that might have helped him through this crisis. The mental health issues that may have caused or contributed to his financial problems continue untreated, creating a vicious cycle where his condition prevents him from taking the steps necessary to improve his situation. No full recovery has been reported, suggesting that as of now, Penn remains trapped in this nightmare with no clear path forward. For a 2-division UFC champion and Hall of Famer to end up broke, isolated, and possibly suffering from severe mental illness represents the absolute worst-case scenario for a retired fighter. Thanks for watching. Check out other cards on the screen.